This Saturday at noon Eastern Time on Fox, Big Noon Kickoff will be hosted in Columbus, Ohio. We have the Nebraska Cornhuskers standing at 5-2 overall, 2-2 in the Big Ten, taking the road to play in the legendary Horseshoe in Columbus, Ohio, against the fourth-ranked 5-1 overall, 2-1 in Big Ten play, the Ohio State Buckeyes. And this is a very, I would say, fascinating matchup because I think how these two teams play in this Big Ten Conference game is going to tell you a little bit about how they are responding to the adversity that they are facing. Both of these teams lost their most recent matchup. Nebraska just got depanted by Indiana, by the Hoosiers, led by Quinton McEnaney, and an Indiana team that's rated in the top 15 in power ratings and in the AP and coaches poll. They're undefeated at 7-0, and I think Quinton McEnaney is in the running, easily the front runner for Coach of the Year. But still, a 56-7 loss is unacceptable for any program that's a blue blood in Nebraska, and Nebraska's in year 2 of a rebuild. And after their blowout loss to Michigan last year, many Nebraska fans and analysts and probably the locker room thought to themselves, okay, this isn't going to happen anymore. Well, it just did happen. This time not in Memorial Stadium, but still in a conference game on the road and against a team that I don't think many are prepared to yet call a national champion contender. Though, as insane as that sounds, Indiana could be a national title contender. They're certainly a college football playoff contender. Ohio State, meanwhile, they did not get depanted. In fact, in hindsight, with Ohio State, taking that bye week, a week of rest and preparation, and we saw some more chaos unfold in college football, and Ohio State and Oregon was a part of that chaos. Ohio State was favored to win, picked to win by many. Oregon beat them, albeit just by 1 point. It looks like Ohio State is still one of the best teams in the country. They're power rated number 1 in both ESPN's FPI and also S&P Plus and also KFord and all these different power ratings. They're up there. But an L is still an L. And many have complained about Ryan Day's record in big games. I have defended Ryan Day, but a loss is a loss, and the way Ohio State lost that game, especially with how their defense performed, was not pretty. And Ohio State's expectations are much higher than Nebraska's. After all, while both are blue blood programs, Nebraska's been at best a mediocre Big Ten team since joining the conference, and in that same time frame outside of 2011 when Luke Fickell was the interim head coach, on an average basis, Ohio State's been the cream of the crop in the conference. They expect to be the best team in the country, and this year, with all they brought back, expected to have an undefeated season, win the national championship. They can still win the national championship, but the undefeated season is dead. So I am very interested to see how both of these teams respond to the adversity that has been presented before them. Obviously, Ohio State is entering this game as the better team. They're favored by 25.5 points. That's where the line opened up. There hasn't been much movement. The last time these two teams played in 2021 was the infamous 3-9 Scott Frost team that couldn't win a close game to save their life. Ohio State was the only team that year who had a 2-score or more win on the Cornhuskers. They won by 9 points, 2 scores, 26-17 specifically that season. But these rosters are almost entirely different. There's a lot of change in the coaching staffs, even though Ryan Day is still the head coach at Ohio State. Obviously, Scott Frost's staff is nowhere to be seen at Nebraska. So let's get into this matchup and talk about how I believe these two teams are going to bounce back ultimately from the adversity they faced, and also who these teams are and what they bring to the table. But before we do that, I ask you to please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new college football content on here. We need you. We need you, because you are the reason why College Football with Sam is the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube. And you are going to be the reason why College Football with Sam is going to be the best college football channel on YouTube. And you know how you can support us? Outside of liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting the bell, and also commenting your thoughts on this matchup down below. If you can, just briefly type your prediction for this game and also some interesting things you think may happen. Maybe a prediction for the pace of the game or who the player of the game is going to be. you can join our Discord server. That will support us a lot, as it'll be a great way for you to communicate with me, to communicate with members of our community. Our Discord server is already close to 100 members right now. We're trying to get to 1,000 before the end of the season. So if you could join that via the link in the description down below in the pinned comment, I'd appreciate that a lot. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, check out my Patreon page or merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, and sign up as a Patreon member to support the work that we do here. And you can also purchase some merchandise, because there's an Ohio State and Nebraska themed College Football with Sam t-shirt awaiting your purchase. You can also get a white or black t-shirt, white or black long sleeve, or even a sweater in those colors. Thank you very much for all your support. But again, doing the things that are for free, joining the Discord server, liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting the bell, commenting, watching the video all the way through, those are the things that you can do to best support us, even more than the things that cost your money. So thank you very much, and let's get right into this. Looking at these teams from a bird's eye view, we like to look at things from a big picture perspective, and then we like to dive into the nitty-gritty details here. The big picture perspective, I think, is best described by a few statistics and also power ratings. Let's start off with the power ratings here. Nebraska is viewed as anywhere from a average, above average, to at best good team nationally. Per FPI, they're 2.9 points better than the average college football team, and per S&P Plus, they're 9.6 points better than the average college football team. Ohio State, meanwhile, is 27.5 points better than the average college football team per FPI, 29.1 points better than the average college football team in S&P Plus. And, well, you can already see why Ohio State's a massive favorite here, because per S&P Plus, once you factor in home field advantage, which is typically 3 points in spread, but I think that for an environment like the Horseshoe, even though it's at noon, more than 3 points is appropriate, like 4, 5, 6, 7 points added would be appropriate. Ohio State is favored by like 24.5, and then you add home field advantage. Per FPI, it's anywhere from like 27.5 to 31.5. Again, once you factor in home field advantage. For S&P Plus, it is a little bit different. It's 19.5. Then when you add home field advantage, 22.5, 23.5, 24.5, 25.5, 26.5, in that range. These two teams are viewed as closer in S&P Plus than FPI. And I do think that Ohio State's obviously the better team here. Nebraska does bring some things here that could maybe give Ohio State some trouble, but Ohio State is favored by multiple scores here for a reason. Their best win is over Iowa by a score of 35-7, where they played kind of a sloppy first half, very dominant second half, and Iowa is a similar caliber of team, if not slightly better than Nebraska, and they murdered that Iowa team. Nebraska's best win at this point is their win over Colorado, the 28-10 win, because Colorado right now I think has hit a different gear, or maybe two, and well, that 28-10 win looks pretty impressive, even if maybe Colorado is a different team than they were in week 2. But anyway, when you look at points per play margin, it's also abundantly clear that Ohio State's the more dominant team. On a points per play margin basis, which means for every one of, let's say, Ohio State or Nebraska's plays, compared to every one of their average opponent plays, what ends up happening is Ohio State scores 0.461 more points per average opponent play. Nebraska only scores 0.012 more points per one of their plays compared to one of their opponent's plays. So the Buckeyes are much more dominant. On an average game in, game out basis, they blow out whatever opponent they face. Meanwhile, for Nebraska, this is in large part due to the fact that Indiana owned them on the football field. They barely scrape by in every game they play. That's what the points per play margin is telling you. Obviously, not all opponents are equal, so it's not like Nebraska is winning every game just by a hair, or Ohio State's winning every game by a blowout. That's just an average. Points per play margin is a good measurement of how dominant your team is. It's why it correlates highly with who wins the national championship. I mean, Michigan, number 1 in points per play margin last year, national champion. Georgia in 21 and 22, number 1 in points per play margin, national champion. Alabama in 2020 was number 1. I think that Ohio State actually in 2019 was the highest in points per play margin. I don't know. At that point, it's off the top of my head, and what I think, I don't exactly know that far back off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's either Ohio State or LSU in points per play margin. Highly doubt it was Clemson due to the fact they played in some close games that year, despite being 14-1. But anyway, Ohio State, again, is the much better team. Game control backs this up. Ohio State's second there. That means only one team in America would play with Ohio State's schedule or would perform at a higher level with Ohio State's schedule than Ohio State does. Only one team. Being top 2 in game control, that's pretty darn impressive. That's really impressive. The only team higher in game control than Ohio State's Ole Miss, that's because Ole Miss is beaten up on a bunch of scrubs. That's exactly why. Like, they've scored 70-something points on multiple scrub opponents. That's a fake dominant statistic for Ole Miss. Ole Miss is not a dominant team. They have not been dominant against any team we give a darn about. If there's any team that's been more dominant than Ohio State in legitimate games, Georgia, even though they have a loss, what they did to Texas was very impressive. And Indiana, I know that they haven't really played much of anyone. However, they're undefeated unlike Ole Miss, and that 56-7 game was very, very impressive. So Ohio State is an elite company there. They have the 36th toughest strength of schedule under their belt. Meanwhile, Nebraska only has the 68th toughest strength of schedule under their belt. They have not played anyone close to Ohio State's caliber in terms of power ratings. In terms of efficiency, I will add that Indiana is close to neck and neck with Ohio State there. And ESPN's efficiency, this isn't the main purpose of efficiency, but this is another way of reading it. Efficiency is how teams are performing this year, not factoring in priors. So if Indiana and Ohio State continue to replicate the success they've had so far this season, they will converge. And by the end of the year, Indiana would not be trailing Ohio State by any more than like a field goal or maybe a touchdown at most in power ratings. So Indiana is up there, and I think it's time to admit that, even though they have a pretty weak strength of schedule. But anyway, when you factor in priors, when you factor in the fact, the data that says that Ohio State is more talented, they're more proven than Indiana is, Nebraska has not played in this type of game. And they're only 28th in game control, so way behind Ohio State in terms of how you would perform given your schedule. I think the critical matchup here is Nebraska and their passing offense against Ohio State's defense. That sounds very weird, but I think that there's logic behind it. Ohio State's rushing offense, with Josh Simmons injured, and with what Nebraska has presented before on defense, that could be an area where Ohio State struggles. That could also be an area where Nebraska struggles. It's a big part of the matchup. It's a big part of Big Ten football, the trenches. But I'm pivoting away from that because Nebraska can't run the football. So if Ohio State can't run the football, it may not even matter because Nebraska can't. Nebraska objectively has a far inferior rushing offense to Ohio State. Ohio State will win the yards per carry and total yards battle unless Chip Kelly or Ryan Day makes some type of idiot move, or Jim Knowles does the same thing and makes a very stupid move on defense. Nebraska's rushing offense is awful, and we're going to get into that. It's one of the least productive rushing offenses in America. It's that bad. Their path to winning, consequentially, I think is, well, it's going to be testing that Ohio State defense. The same defense, the same secondary, the same linebacker core that struggled to cover Oregon's receivers and tight ends, and that didn't get all that much pressure on Dylan Gabriel. That defense didn't. So what can Nebraska's offensive tackles, their guards, their center, how can they handle Ohio State's defensive line? How are they going to do that? How do they do that? How do Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, Caden Curry, Kenyatta Jackson, how do they attack Ben Scott, Justin Evans, Henry Lutovsky, Bryce Benhart, and Turner Corcoran? How do they do it? And then beyond that, how do Denzel Burke, Lathan Ransom, Caleb Downs, Davison Igbinosun, Jordan Hancock, Sonny Styles, Cody Simon, Arvell Reese, CJ Hicks, Jermaine Matthews Jr., if he plays, which in a game like this, if Ohio State ends up pulling away as they're favored to, he should get playing time. He should get reps. He's a future All-American. You have to play those type of players. How do they do against Dylan Raiola, against Jamal Banks, against Isaiah Nair, against Janiron Bonner, Jalen Lloyd, Ja'Cory Barney Jr., Thomas Fidone, and Nate Borkacher? And also, what does Ramir Johnson and Dante Dowdle and Emmett Johnson do? How do they factor in to this game? Because they've all had their ups and downs throughout the season. I think that's the critical matchup here. Ohio State is going to win. They're going to win the rushing battle. They just are. They're too good at running back, and Nebraska is too poor at run blocking, both on the O-line and at wide receiver, even at tight end. They can't run block. They can't. And I don't know why that is. It's a big issue, especially for being a Big Ten team. They can't run block. And against Illinois late and Indiana for the entire game, their defense on the ground has been exposed a little bit too. I think Ohio State may, and probability I think says they will, have a better rushing performance on the ground against Nebraska than they did against Oregon. So I think that is the critical matchup. Nebraska's passing offense and pass protection against Ohio State's pass defense and pass rush. Let's take a deep dive into these offenses here, shall we? Obviously, Ohio State's offense is better. Nebraska, I think, is only better at one position, and that's tight end. I would take Thomas Fidone, Nate Borkacher, and Luke Lindenmeyer over G. Scott Jr., Will Kazmarek, and Jelani Thurman. I would. Not by this massive margin, but by a slight margin. And it's not a push because I feel somewhat confident in that. But I'm very confident that Travion Henderson, Quinjon Judkins, and James Peoples are better than Ramir Johnson, Dante Dowdle, and Emmett Johnson. I'm also very confident that Seth McLaughlin, Donovan Jackson, Tegra Shabola, Josh Fryer, and Zen Michalski are better than Turner Corcoran, Justin Evans, Ben Scott, Henry Lutovsky, and Bryce Benhart. Very confident in that. And at wide receiver, well, Nebraska's starters, their best receiver is either Isaiah Nair or Jamal Banks. Their best receiver would not be in the top, I would say, 3 of Ohio State's best receivers. They'd be 4th, 5th, in that range. Ohio State with Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Emeka Igbuka, Brandon Innes, Bryson Rogers, Jaden Ballard, way better than Nebraska's Jamal Banks, Isaiah Nair, Bonner, Lloyd, Barney Jr., and Carter Nelson, who made the move from tight end to wide receiver. Excited to see how his development goes. And these offenses, you look at the numbers, they're far different. Ohio State is 5th in points per game, scoring 43.5. Nebraska is 80th, scoring 23.5. These numbers, by the way, do not include FCS opponents, so Nebraska's game against Northern Iowa here doesn't count. Ohio State hasn't played an FCS opponent. This is because TeamRankings.com doesn't use data in FCS versus FBS games. Ohio State scores 0.644 points per play. That's 5th. Nebraska, meanwhile, only scores 0.326 points per play, which is 91st. Did any of you catch Marcus Satterfield saying he wanted to average 4 to 6 yards per play nationally? Yeah, that's actually kind of some Brian Ferentz stuff right there. Although Brian Ferentz would probably say 3 to 5 yards per play, but that's still pretty close. And Nebraska, guess what, Marcus Satterfield? They're operating in that range. According to you, the offense is a success. They're averaging 5 yards per play, which is a whopping 95th nationally. Meanwhile, Chip Kelly and Ryan Day, who combined are geniuses on the offensive side of the ball, are averaging 7.5 yards per play, which is 4th. Ohio State's top 5 in total yards per game as well. Top 5 in second half points per game, third quarter points per game, red zone scoring percentage, offensive touchdowns per game, offensive points per game, yards per point margin. Nebraska is outside of the top 75 in all of those categories, all of them that I named. Nebraska actually scores 16 first half points per game, which is 38th. They only score 7.5 second half points per game, 124th. Their second half offense is Michigan's entire offense this year, which is just that's something. And then you look at the rushing offense. Ohio State is still, even after a game where they did not look good running the football, they're averaging 6 yards per carry, which is 5th. Nebraska's averaging 3.4, which is 105th. Ohio State's averaging 208.8 rushing yards per game, which is 16th. Nebraska's averaging 124.7, which is 93rd. And Nebraska actually runs the ball for about 1.3 more plays per game than Ohio State does. So the drastic difference in efficiency between these two teams cannot be overstated. And passing the football, Ohio State is 35th in yards per completion, 9th in yards per pass attempt. Nebraska's 105th in yards per completion and 78th in yards per pass attempt. Ohio State is actually 3rd in completion percentage too. Will Howard's been playing like a near elite to elite quarterback all season long. 71.58% of Ohio State's passes are completed. Only 64.68% of Nebraska's are completed, which is 34th. And the numbers are still not positive in the direction of Nebraska on offense. Dylan Raiola leads the team in passing yards with 1,592, averaging 7.5 yards per pass attempt. He has 9 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Honestly, 3 of his 6 interceptions aren't his fault, but he still threw 2 pretty bad balls against Indiana. It sounds like he's injured. He is clearly not playing his best game, I think in part because of the injury. And at this point, I think there's a good chance you may be looking at him as a limited quarterback through the rest of the season because the injuries are piling up on offense. He himself is injured. And I don't know how this team's going to respond after that 56-7 blowout loss. Typically, teams don't respond all that well when they get blown out and then they have to play another opponent the following week who can also put on that same type of blowout performance. The leading rusher of Nebraska is Dante Dowdle with 350 rushing yards. He's averaging 4.3 yards per carry, and he has 5 rushing touchdowns. Ja'Cory Barney, wide receiver for Nebraska, has 3 rushing touchdowns and 111 yards. He's averaging 13.9 yards per carry. Pay attention to him, along with Ramir Johnson and Emmett Johnson, who each have over 100 rushing yards. Also pay attention to quarterback Heinrich Harburg, who's been used at times as kind of a wildcat quarterback, an option quarterback. I wouldn't be shocked if he got more playing time also as just all around Nebraska's QB number 1, or just got some reps as the backup in some passing situations against Ohio State because of Raiola's injury and the offense needs a spark. And then at receiver, Jamal Banks, Isaiah Nayer, Thomas Fidone, Jalen Lloyd, Ja'Cory Barney Jr., Ramir Johnson, and Emmett Johnson all have over 100 receiving yards. Nayer and Banks lead the team in receiving yards with over 300 each, and Banks has 2 receiving touchdowns. Isaiah Nayer has 4. For Ohio State, Will Howard leads them in passing yards with 1,574, averaging 9.5 yards per pass attempt, 14 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. He's completing 73.3% of his throws. Quinshon Judkins leads the team in rushing yards with 491, 6 rushing touchdowns. He just had a hand procedure this past weekend, but it doesn't sound like he'll miss any playing time. Prayers up to him. Hopefully that can heal very quickly. I do think Henderson's the best back on the team, though. He's averaging 8.2 yards per carry, 4 rushing touchdowns with 424 rushing yards. I think the Oregon game showed that in big games, he is going to be the better rushing threat than Quinshon Judkins will. At receiving, Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, They each have over 200 receiving yards and at least one receiving touchdown. Smith has 7 receiving touchdowns, averaging 17.3 yards per reception with 553 receiving yards. Ibuka has 526 receiving yards with 6 receiving touchdowns, averaging 13.1 yards per reception with 40 receptions. Ohio State's only allowed 5 sacks all season long. Nebraska has allowed 14. When you look at the sack rate for both of these teams, Nebraska has a 6.07% sack rate, which is 65th. Ohio State has a 2.56 sack rate, which is 14th. So clearly, whether it's quarterback, running back, wide receiver, or the offensive line, really at any point on the offense, Ohio State is better. I'd say, yet again, outside of that tight end position. On defense, I would take Ohio State on the defensive line after what I saw against Indiana. I think that Nebraska's defense, specifically their run defense, is a paper tiger. And I think there's a lot of truth in that with their defense overall. I think it's a good defense, but elite. Like I said in my reaction video to Indiana versus Nebraska, number 1 defense in S&P Plus entering that Indiana-Nebraska game. That's what Tony White had. And what an absolute joke of a performance they put on. Defensive line, that goes to Ohio State. Safety, clearly with Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs and how they're performing, that goes to Ohio State. I do think there's a lot of competition between these two rooms at linebacker and corner, though. In fact, if you put a gun to my head, I would pick Nebraska at both. Certainly at the start, certainly with like their 3 or 2 best at the position. You get deeper and deeper at corner, I would say Ohio State's better, but at that point you're talking about players who may or may not see the field all that much, and it's similar at linebacker. I think that Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams, and Ty Hamilton, they're not putting up awesome numbers, but I think the scheme does more to handicap them than anything else. Meanwhile, for Nebraska, scheme in part does that, but I don't think their ends are close to Jack Sawyer or JT Tuimoloau. Nash Hutmacher and Ty Robinson are close to Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton, but I would actually still lean Ohio State there because I think that Tyleik Williams is an absolute beast and Ty Hamilton isn't that far behind him. These defenses this season, I think, have performed overall well, but they've had some incredibly disappointing showings too. Ohio State has 17 sacks on the season, 19 passes defended, 4 interceptions, 6 forced fumbles, and 5 fumble recoveries. Nebraska has 21 sacks on the season, 27 passes defended, 8 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles, and 3 fumble recoveries. Both defenses, I think, are doing a better job at forcing turnovers than they were last year. At the beginning of the year, it looks like Ohio State was better at getting to the quarterback, regardless of scheme change compared to last year, but I don't know, and I don't really think that's the case anymore. I think that this Ohio State defense is similar to last year, with probably higher upside slightly at getting to the quarterback, but also a lower ceiling and lower floor when it comes to defending the pass in the secondary in coverage. For Nebraska, I think a large part of why their defense looks the way it does is because last year they faced no competent offense worth a lick outside of Michigan, who, well, blew them out. And you could say similar things to Ohio State, but, they played Missouri, did well in the Cotton Bowl. They played Michigan. Penn State's offense was better than any offense Nebraska faced all season long outside of that Michigan offense. And same thing with Notre Dame, to be frank. So Ohio State's defense last year actually played multiple good offenses. Passing offense, I feel like that may have inflated Ohio State's passing defense last year because the best pass offense Ohio State played last year, y'all want to take a guess at what it was by the numbers? It was Michigan. Michigan was the best passing offense Ohio State played last season. And I think we all know that J.J. McCarthy and Roman Wilson and Colston Loveland and Cornelius Johnson were not exactly the type of passing offense that would get multiple 75-yard receptions on anyone. They just kind of killed you with 1,000 razor blade cuts. But for Nebraska, I just think that last season it's rung true that they didn't really play any offenses last year. So their defense was wildly inflated. And now they played an offense in Indiana this season that may have been better than Michigan's offense last year. Defense, certainly not. Offense, it's a possibility. Ohio State's offense, I don't know if it's better than Michigan's of last season, but probably in the same ballpark, maybe a little bit better, maybe a little bit worse, but that's two near elite to elite offenses that they've played compared to the one of last year. And I don't know. I think there may be something to that, and how Nebraska's defense has been puffed up by performances against not so good offenses. I mean, what they did to Colorado's offense in hindsight was impressive, but Colorado doesn't exactly, they don't produce, they don't have a top 10 offense. They don't play at that level. Their defense is better than last year, same with their offense, but I don't think they have a top 10 offense still. Maybe at their peak they do, but they have not shown week after week after week that they can sustain their potential for 60 minutes of a game. Still a very good team, better than last year, but they're not like this Ohio State offense or Indiana offense. Not even close. Pay attention to Nash Hutmacher and Ty Robinson for Nebraska, and also John Bullock. Those players are going to be what Nebraska needs to lean on to help slow down Ohio State's rushing offense, which is what Ohio State wants their identity to be. I don't know if it is, because they harshly pivoted away from it against Oregon, but at the same time, they weren't able to run against Oregon in the second half. They were very much able to pass, so just do what you have to do to win, and I think Ohio State, to a certain degree, did that in that matchup. The Buckeyes will want to run the football here. And Nash Hutmacher on the season, he has 2 sacks, 16 total tackles, doesn't have a forced fumble yet. John Bullock has 2 sacks, a pick 6, 3 passes defended, a forced fumble, 36 total tackles. And Ty Robinson has 4 sacks, 3 passes defended, and 16 total tackles. Watch out for them and that Nebraska defensive line. For Ohio State, I would say pay attention to Denzel Burke. How does he look after what was a pretty embarrassing performance against Oregon? Does he bounce back? Look at Jordan Hancock, Davison Igbinosun, that cornerback room, nickelback area that kind of got exposed a little bit against Oregon. And also pay attention, I would say, to Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams too, because Nebraska will run the football, because that's a part of their identity and they're sort of stubbornly sticking to it. So pay attention to them. And then GT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. Did they do a better job than Indiana's defensive ends and pressures of getting to the quarterback? On the season, Jack Sawyer, I believe, no, GT Tuimoloau leads the team in sacks with 3. Sawyer has 2.5 sacks and a forced fumble and leads Tuimoloau in tackles. And you also got to look in the secondary, where Denzel Burke has 2 interceptions, no passes defended though, and then Davison Igbinosun also has an interception and 2 passes defended. Moving on, trench warfare, I think, goes to Ohio State. I don't think there should be any more comment about that, really. Better offensive line by a mile, slightly better defensive line, if not modestly better defensive line. So Ohio State wins the trench battle. And for special teams, I think in hindsight it was pretty unwise of Ryan Day to not hire a special teams coordinator, because the special teams have not been playing well. After all, Oregon, well, they won the field position battle. Special teams was a part of their victory, and it's not like Oregon special teams is perfect. They do have kicking issues, for example. I think that a special teams coach for Ohio State in the future could legitimately help them win a national championship, for example. But Nebraska special teams are so awful that Ohio State special teams unit looks like an NFL special teams unit compared to what the Cornhuskers have, which at this point is worse than a high school special teams unit. And at coaching, I would take Ohio State any day at any position over Nebraska. I think that Ohio State is the better head coach, the better offensive coordinator, better offensive assistants, better defensive coordinator, better defensive assistants, and better strength and conditioning coaching staff. However, big but here, this could be a prove-it game for Tony White, and also could be a prove-it game for Jim Knowles. I happen to think the prove-it game for Tony White is probably the games following this, because Nebraska, as we've already discussed, is severely outmatched here. And the prove-it game for Jim Knowles is probably against Penn State or Indiana. But it could happen. It could happen in this game, even if Ohio State wins, where you look back and say, I think that Tony White actually called a better game and looked like the better DC than Jim Knowles. Just something to pay attention to. Ultimately, I'm picking Ohio State to win, and I'm picking them to cover. I don't think that they will put on the same dominant performance as Indiana did, because I think that Ohio State's going to be looking ahead a little bit to Penn State. I think that the style of football Ohio State wants to play is not going to be as high scoring as the style of football that Indiana wants to play. I also think that Indiana has the better offense than Ohio State does, to be frank. I think that Ohio State has more talent, but Indiana is better at play calling, better to put themselves in a position to win, and more efficient. And I think that Nebraska here is not going to put up 2 games in a row with an F performance. If they do, the doubt of Matt Rule should gain some volume. It honestly should. I mean, if Nebraska loses this game 70-0 or 63-7, or it's just from the gut not competitive again, you got to begin to look at coaching changes for Nebraska, or at least look at some heavy portal additions, or there's got to be some type of self-reflection, some type of accountability taken, because back-to-back blowouts, losses by 40-plus points, 50-plus points, that's not acceptable. It's not. And that Indiana-Nebraska game could have been worse. It could have been 63-7, could have been 70-7. Curt Cignetti, remember, took a knee with over a minute left, and Curtis Rourke didn't throw a wide open seam route on 4th down that would have given Indiana an extra touchdown. I think the Buckeyes win 42-14. I think that coming off of the bye, Ohio State will look sluggish and kind of uninterested for a quarter or a half. It'll be similar to the Iowa game, except higher scoring, because I think Nebraska has a higher upside in offense than Iowa does in the passing attack, which I think is where Ohio State's weakness may lie this year on defense. And I also think that Iowa's defense matches up better with Ohio State's offense than Nebraska's defense does. So 42-14, Ohio State wins, and they cover. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Kind of Little OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Slane, Ismar, Tyler, Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgens, and Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Please check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Go Buckeyes, and go Big Red.